Thank you for holding on till the bitter end. Your reward will be to be told where the drinks are, but not yet. Moral analysis is simply an attempt to assess the relative importance of things that reasonable people care about. This will be one quick example. It's urgent to hold the temperature rise to as close as possible to 1.5, mainly to minimize the number of tipping points, points of no return, like the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, that we force the climate system to pass, lest we unnecessarily saddle future generations with crushing burdens. And it's urgent to maintain and enhance the momentum of efforts to lift from current generations the already crushing burdens of poverty that blight the only lives that these fellow humans are ever going to have. It would be outrageous to attempt to slow the pace of the escape from malnutrition and drudgery as a means of reserving more of the remaining carbon budget for the indulgence of our own optional preferences, that is, to constrain subsistence emissions in order to preserve luxury emissions. The challenging question is how to think about the relationship between these two separately compelling concerns, ending climate disruption and ending grinding poverty. We could, first, try to come as close as possible to respecting each, while more or less equally respecting the other. To make that less abstract with an artificial example, one could say do 85% of what will be necessary in order to keep the temperature rise to 1.5, in order to also do 85% of what would be necessary in order to allow the poorest to escape poverty. 2 points about that approach. First, this would be disastrous because it would mean that neither constraint would be fully honored. In each case, it would be close but no cigar. Second, this is where we're probably headed. The attitude now seems to be to do the best we can for each consideration while compromising it enough to avoid having to compromise the other consideration any more than we're compromising the first. This is one manner in which political compromise regularly goes wrong. Equal compromise leading to equal inadequacy. Call this approach the double compromise, which I think would surely lead to double disaster, too much climate change and too little poverty eradication. So a second approach would be to compromise one of the two considerations enough to honor the other one fully. Call this the single compromise. But 2 points can be immediately made about this possibility. First, it's off the table politically. Neither the leading developed nor the leading developing countries will willingly sacrifice their first priority. And as everyone knows, they each respectively have opposite priorities. Second, it would in any case be deeply unreasonable because each consideration is overwhelmingly important. There's no good reason to make one of them secondary to the other. So what we have to do is innovate approaches that respect both these considerations as fully as possible. Obviously, every approach must include rapid, ambitious cuts in carbon emissions by those societies that already enjoy a high enough level of development to provide a decent life for all of their own citizens. Call this ambitious mitigation by economically adequate societies, societies without a large percentage of their members mired in poverty. This would be the leadership on mitigation by the developed that the UNFCCC has required from the beginning. How ambitious this mitigation by the economically adequate needs to be depends on what else we're doing. Speaking very generally, the world must obtain far less energy from carbon-based sources and much more energy from non-carbon-based sources in order not to exceed the carbon budget for a temperature rise of close to 1.5. And this means, as is generally understood, moving rapidly to net zero carbon emissions. The interesting issues arise when we move to the question, where should the new sources of non-carbon-based energy be predominantly located? Inside the countries wealthy enough to fund them themselves? No. The new energy needs to go at least equally to where the eradication of poverty is moving fastest. Many impoverished and deprived human beings are generally deprived, in part because they're energy deprived. If deprivation ought to be eliminated, more energy ought to reach the deprived, and the additional energy will be compatible with not exceeding the carbon budget only to the extent that it's not carbon-based. Additional energy needs to go where the poverty is, not only where the wealth is. This means, among other things, that for nations for whom only carbon-based energy is affordable now, non-carbon-based energy ought to be subsidized as necessary so that their poverty elimination does not worsen climate change. A hopeful sign, of course, is that non-carbon energy has already become more affordable through market processes, but the market responses so far have not been fast enough to prevent many lives from still being lived entirely in abject poverty. Quickly enhancing the trend toward greater affordability of non-carbon energy is essential for development compatible with climate stability. And from the point of view of the rest of us, the well-off, the more of the additional energy for the deprived that remains carbon-based, the more ambitious the reductions in carbon-based energy by us, the affluent, must be for the globe as a whole to meet the same carbon budget. If emissions increase somewhere, they must decrease by more than that amount elsewhere if total emissions are to decline to net zero. New sources of non-carbon energy need to go where the escape from deprivation is escalating in order to minimize increases there in use of carbon energy. So, first, concern for minimizing the deterioration of the climate while continuing to attack poverty requires a prompt energy transition in poorer countries. More non-carbon energy in poor areas serves both the goals. More non-carbon energy in rich areas serves only one, the climate one. The second reason why there must be much more energy from non-carbon-based sources accessible to those who cannot now afford it themselves is less obvious and is deeply political. As climate change progressively worsens, many nations face rising costs in dealing with loss and damage and rising costs for adaptation. This has already been happening for some time. Some nations receive some international assistance for either loss and damage or adaptation, but assistance is meager so far. Each government is primarily responsible for financing any actions required for its own citizens by either loss and damage or adaptation. Any enhancement in poverty elimination is a third source of expense. Meanwhile, fourth, the transition from carbon-based energy to non-carbon-based energy would require additional investments, especially in new energy sources and/or distribution infrastructures. Incorporating the energy transition into development is necessary for a sustainable form of development and is the ideal for the long run. But the energy transition is not needed for less sustainable forms of development. So in the short run, non-sustainable development, for example, building additional coal-burning generating plants for increasing supplies of electricity, may be cheaper than sustainable development. If a nation is sufficiently impoverished, it may not be able to afford all four of these types of expenses: loss and damage, adaptation, basic development, and the energy transition. Experience shows that governments forced to prioritize among these four kinds of expense will rank the energy transition last. And if they can't afford all four, they will neglect the energy transition. Their fundamental reasoning seems to be this: apart from so far relatively inconsequential forms of international assistance, no one else is going to pay very much for our loss and damage, our adaptation, or our development. Since dealing with all three of these is indispensable for providing for the basic needs of our own people, we must prioritize them. If we do not, no one else will. But others may contribute to our energy transition because reductions in our carbon emissions will directly benefit the others too. So contributing to our emission reductions is clearly in their interest to a much greater extent than they think contributing to our other three expenses is. And the poor country leaders are right. It is more obviously in the interest of the wealthier nations to contribute to a more rapid energy transition by the poorer ones, where it's otherwise not going to happen, because everyone needs as rapid reductions as possible in carbon emissions. Many poorer nations cannot spare the resources to pay for the energy transition, and the richer nations can spare the resources. Any contribution by wealthier nations to speeding the energy transition in the poorer nations will qualitatively improve any development that's underway by making it more sustainable. They get development that's more sustainable, and we all get more rapid compliance with a relatively reasonable carbon budget. Conclusion: all nations have a shared interest in making non-carbon-based energy as soon as possible affordable for and accessible to the poor who are escaping poverty. Negative emissions, which have come up quite a bit today. We cannot hold the temperature rise to anywhere near 1.5 without large quantities of negative emissions. If owners of fossil fuels had any commitment to the public interest, they would long ago have invested heavily in research on technologies like CCS in order to begin to reduce the pollution that their own highly profitable products have injected into the atmosphere at everyone else's expense. Instead, they've continued for decades, knowingly and willingly, to undermine the climate with carbon pollution while leaving all the rest of us to deal with it. So, first, the absurdly massive public subsidies for fossil fuels should quickly be eliminated, except in very special cases. Second, in a last appeal to their own narrow interest, governments need to pass carbon taxes or otherwise price their carbon pollution to try to get the owners to respond. But third, and most important, fossil fuel vendors must be forced by law to contribute to negative emissions as long as they continue to do business. They've already established that they will not choose to do so voluntarily. Coalitions of governments, for example, the US, the PRC, and the EU, should explore ways to make carbon fuel marketing in their own societies conditional on some kind of carbon capture. Fuel containing a ton of carbon could be sold only if, say, 2 tons of carbon are very soon verifiably sequestered by some kind of carbon capture technology. This might be implemented through, for example, an initially high supplementary carbon capture tax, the proceeds of which would go into development and dissemination of technologies for capture and removal of carbon, including the demonstration projects that Pete Smith mentioned this morning. And if negative emissions turn out to be impossible or intolerable, as Stefan suggested this morning, the sooner we find out, the better. The capture tax could be reduced later if the technologies are functioning effectively at scale and we still need fossil fuels. It's deeply unfair not to require long-time polluters to clean up a little of their own pollution if they are to continue in business, rather than continuing to allow all environmental costs, including all the costs of climate change, to be generally externalized to everyone, rich and poor, living and yet to be born.
Look, we have time for at least one, maybe two clarifying questions, points of responses to Henry Shue's talk. Anybody want to raise a question now? Oh, come on. Totally. Come on. Yes.
Henry, do you get any sense at all that political leaders are remotely thinking the way you're talking?
No, they've been captured by the fossil fuel interests. We have to treat them as the enemies they are. I mean, I'm an American. The U.S. Congress is utterly corrupt. They depend on campaign contributions from fossil fuel interests. But there are other levels of government in the U.S., for example, that might do it. California might do it. California is very progressive. I agree. We're up against a very powerful enemy, but I think it's time we recognize that they are an enemy and did our best to tackle them. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I sure think you were. Yeah, up in the back, Michael.
So, Henry, I agree. Your analysis, in particular, of the thinking in governments is very elegant and very nicely done. The situation, although in spirit I agree with you, is more complicated in the real world because of the political difficulty of essentially transfers to developing countries. And you know what the politics of that is like, with the developed countries never coming through with even a modest fraction of what they promised, for instance. But there are also other ways to get around this, and I'm not suggesting this solves all problems, but just there is the recent example of the pairing of the desire of Germany making a decision on the Energiewende, and then China making a maybe parallel decision to make a big investment in photovoltaics, which resulted in essentially money that looked like it was going to be spent in a developed country actually going into the pot in a developing country and presumably helping China in numerous ways. So it may be that we need a mixture of responses and some creative thinking about how to do that.
No, I take that as a friendly amendment, and I think one could view the money spent by Germany on its feed-in tariffs as a form of assistance for getting renewable fuels into the third world by helping to drive the price down. So, right, I don't just mean kind of traditional foreign aid, which again, politically, in an age when people are getting more and more xenophobic, is not going to work. So we have to be smart. But I still think we need to look for ways to get to head off what will otherwise be the massive increase in emissions as nations develop. And I think, A, they're going to develop whether we like it or not, but B, they have a perfect right to. And so we should actually be assisting.
Great, thank you. So let's move on now. We have some follow-on comments from Professor Benito Mueller at the Climate Policy Research Center at the University of Oxford. Benito.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is actually quite difficult for me because I feel emotionally duty-bound to dedicate this session to a good friend of mine who passed away tragically 2 weeks ago, Dr. Paul Baer. And I find it very difficult to talk about it. So what I would like to do is I would like to put up this eulogy by Tom Athanasiou and ask you to join me in a moment of silence and reading it before I start my response. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, I will leave it on because I also don't have a presentation. I will now turn, I'm sort of having settled down a bit, I will now turn to respond to Henry's talk. And I feel my moral responsibility is to be critical, because otherwise it's boring. Okay. I will take the liberty to quote out of context, quite deliberately, because I want to make a couple of points, and I will quote a couple of things, and I'm sure Henry has actually, in the full context, addressed these, but bear with me, Henry. The very first sentence in Henry's talk was that moral analysis simply tries to assess the relative importance of things that reasonable people care about. Now, to me, I have to mention that I have a doctor in philosophy from this university, and I did start climate change with climate justice considerations for quite a long time, and I'm still working on it. I think Henry's assessment is actually more a matter of political analysis. Moral analysis, I believe, myself, it involves the analysis of state of affairs with respect to certain moral norms. It's a normative evaluation. Norms like principles of rights and duties or of distributive justice. In particular, the now apparently persona non grata principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is one of those principles enshrined in the UNFCCC, which is used to defend moral positions and valuations in this context. Now, I wrote down, I will take the example of a moral assessment of the mitigation problem, and I said this can be framed as a matter of sharing a global mitigation burden, which we were told last night that we don't do anymore. So my first example is already out of the window, but I will do it anyway, right? And the question there is, the moral question is, what is the share that countries can fairly be expected to cover? And I would like to mention the fact that the Kyoto, in my mind, one of the reasons the Kyoto Protocol failed to be an enduring treaty, for reasons we don't have to agree with, but it failed because of equity. Because the Americans felt it was, some of the strong Americans felt it was inequitable, or at least they portrayed it as such, right? So equity is not something which is just ephemeral in realpolitik, and it doesn't work. It is very, very important to take it into account, not because people want to be equitable, but because people feel very strongly about if they feel they are treated inequitably. That is the main thing to avoid. Otherwise, they don't buy in. Now, just to give you an example, in the context of Kyoto, there was a completely other, equally valid point of view or framing of this mitigation issue, which is a matter of resource allocation. The moment we have assigned amounts for countries allocated and they are tradable, it can legitimately be seen as an allocation of a resource, which then leads to implications which are quite different from the burden sharing scheme. In the burden sharing scheme, we can agree of who does more or less, but if anyone makes a profit, they are evil. They are sort of war profiteers, right? If you frame it as a resource allocation and you trade, if you have surplus permits, it's legitimate benefits you make out of this system. And if then someone says you're not allowed to do that, then you are a colonialist aggressor taking away our resources again. So you have these different points of view, and this is, I think, a matter of moral analysis to show that where can you have different points of view leading to contradictory conclusions, but which are equally valid. Because in moral science you can have that. In physical science you can't. If two theories predict a different outcome, one of them is wrong. In moral science, this is not the case. That's where we then have to start compromising and talking to each other. Now, even if we stay with the burden sharing idiom, it is quite possible, and I think indeed highly likely, that a fair sharing of the global mitigation costs of achieving 1.5 degrees would have to involve a significant international resource transfer. Now, Henry addresses this, and he states it is more obviously in the interest of wealthier nations to contribute to a more rapid energy transition in the poorer ones. But just to show, it being in the interest of the wealthier countries is a political analysis. In my mind, in the moral analysis, is that they ought to do it as a matter of normative justice. The other thing, the final thing which I would like to put up, is when Henry says, in the context of progressively worsening climate change, many nations face rising costs in dealing with loss and damage, and rising costs for adaptation. Each government is primarily responsible for financing any actions required for its own citizens. It's true. Governments have a moral duty of care. But if we are talking about not acts of God, but anthropogenic impacts and damages and losses, the ball game changes. Because all of a sudden, we are in a situation of compensatory justice. We are in the things that if you harm someone and you are responsible, then you ought to compensate. And this, I felt, was not really pushed enough in Henry's talk, that in the moral context, these sort of things still matter. I know we don't want to talk about them anymore, but I think we need to. Thank you very much.
Responses to your responses, and then we'll come back to some additional points. Yes, sir, over here.
So I'm going to pass the baton here.
And thank you for letting us remember Paul. It strikes me that Paris was a sort of an attempt to be value-free rather than to tussle with the problem of equity. But it's also set up in such a way that if players in the game, this value-free game that's been created, start to willfully fail to perform, the inequity issue will rise and bubble to the surface all over again, depending on how the measurements take place. So we've already seen the INDCs being categorized as adequate and inadequate, and everyone's been very nice about it. But what do you think will happen to the question of equity that is just, in a sense, hidden in the Paris Agreement at this stage? I'm happy.
Did I answer? Okay. I mean, I sincerely believe that we have not finished with the equity issue in this context. Okay, not at all, because as you said yourself, we have no way of actually ascertaining what is a fair INDC at the moment. Not NDC. Sorry. And I have been working with some friends, with Cholisa from South Africa, about an ambition mechanism with the stock taking and the upgrade. One thing which we have so far not had really any grasp is how can we make sure that in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and that's what I was talking about yesterday. I wasn't talking about Paris or how difficult it is to find a common formula for equity. That was not my question. My question is, given where we stand, how can we make sure that these inevitable equity concerns, which will be raised, and which are actually detrimental to the activity ambition, not to the stated ambition of a temperature goal, but to what people do. If I think what you're doing is inadequate, unfair, I will not do as much as I can do. And these sort of things have to be overcome. But to be honest, so far I have not really. If you have any ideas, let me know.
So let's take one more question, response. Sir, up at the top.
The concept of hurt and then compensate implies a pricing mechanism, which I have to say the private sector, which I come from, we usually win. And it's then we work out how it's worthwhile to carry on hurting because the fine doesn't really matter, it's a compensation. As opposed to hurt with a pricing mechanism as a deterrent, which is very different than compensation. It's punitive. It's something that says, thou shalt not, because you will get seriously hurt as an industry or an entity or a government. Very, very different principles. I wasn't sure which one you had.
This is being webcast, right? Because I'm extremely, what's the word? Happy that I get this from the private sector. This is a very good, because the moment you start talking about punitive damages, I mean, compensation becomes positively harmless, right? But you may be right. You may be right. All I'm saying is that a moral discourse on these issues is necessary. We cannot avoid it. And it starts before loss and damage. Loss and damage is part of it, but it starts before in terms of ambition of mitigation action. We are seriously harming the potential ambition which we could get if we do not engage in the equity and justice debate in this context. If we just put it under the carpet, we will reduce the ambition which we could get otherwise.
Benito, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before I make a couple of remarks and then open it up again for discussion, I just wanted to ask Professor Shue if you wanted to respond to Benito's response.
Okay. Benito raised some very deep issues. I gave a talk about human rights and justice. I just didn't mention those words. But when I insist that eradication of poverty is uncompromisable, that's because I think that subsistence rights are among the basic human rights, and they are uncompromisable, and that justice demands that we recognize them. However, as Benito said, I wanted to also talk politically. I find when you talk about justice and human rights, what usually happens is people say, oh yeah, right, I'm for that. Now let's go back and talk about the real problem. So I wanted to try to embed them in the real problem. And I think that where one can appeal to self-interest in alliance with morality, precisely because the politics is so lousy at the moment, then it's useful to appeal to it. So I think there is some self-interest behind our being willing to try to head off the huge carbon emissions that I think might otherwise come from, say, India. And that there's no reason not to appeal to that interest too. But I certainly agree with Benito. If that turned out not to be correct, I still think we ought to do it. But since a lot of our politicians don't seem interested in what we ought to do, I think if one can also talk about what's in our interest, that's a useful thing to do. But Benito's absolutely right. We shouldn't let the moral stuff get submerged, though I think we have to tie it into particular practical implications, which involve making a lot of assumptions about how things work, and if you get those wrong, of course, then you get the wrong conclusion.
So thank you. I just want to make a couple of remarks about the question of responsibility, teeing up a little bit off of what Henry and Benito just said. But obviously the framework convention, the language of common but differentiated responsibilities is language that refers to parties, to nations. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well is, including in this forthcoming special report, will focus primarily on the question of national actions and national responsibilities. Henry, you spoke briefly about the notion of responsibility for fossil fuel companies, both given their large contribution to the problem and what they've done in light of the evidence of the risks of their products. I'll be speaking a little bit about this in a parallel session tomorrow afternoon. I wanted just to say a couple of words, not from a scholarly background, on the question of our responsibilities or my responsibilities as a scientist in a civil society organization as it relates to the issues that we're talking about here today and tomorrow. So two symbols matter a lot, and two symbols that I take away from the conversation in Paris last December in terms of how civil society weighed in on the question of 1.5 and our response to it. Many of you may recall the image of the Eiffel Tower lit up at night, right? One version of that image, one night it was lit up with a blazing image of 1.5 degrees, very powerful public symbol, very motivating in the context of the negotiations. Another night it was lit up with an equally powerful symbol that said 100% renewables, right? Another very powerful symbol. But as we know from our conversations here and as we've learned from the modeling that's been done so far, those two are not well aligned. And then in fact, we really can't assume that 100% renewable energy coupled with efficiency, presumably, would bring us anywhere near a carbon budget associated with the 1.5 degree target. So I think in my role as a scientist, as I said, in a civil society organization, sort of focused on communicating science and evidence to decision makers in the public in the hopes that they will take that on in their decision making at a range of levels, want to think about what role we have to communicate accurately and effectively around the challenges and opportunities that we face. And there's a historical dimension to this that I just want to note. In the run-up to the Kyoto Protocol, in some of the years following it, there was, certainly within what I would call broadly the climate community, the public-facing climate community, a lot of reluctance to talk about adaptation in the fear and the concern that it would take the winds out of the sail of motivation for mitigation, for reducing emissions. Many may recall this as a debate. Vice President Al Gore in the US, after he was vice president, spoke about climate at length, was actually spent a lot of time warning that we shouldn't be talking about adaptation, that it would reduce motivations for mitigation. Well, we learned that we needed to do both and, that it was not an either-or proposition, and that we figured out we can do this, and in fact, talking about adaptation and engaging in it both in a scientific level and in the policy process and in public engagement has not, in fact, reduced motivation for mitigation, quite the contrary. Similarly, in the early part of the last decade, as discussions around the role of forests in climate mitigation came to the fore in the international climate process, there was a great deal of concern expressed by many international NGOs and others that we shouldn't talk about the role of forests, particularly in slowing deforestation in developing countries in the context of climate mitigation, because it would take the wind out of the sails of reducing motivation for the need for emissions reductions, particularly from industrialized countries. And there was a big and lengthy and complicated and ultimately unhelpful, in my view, debate over whether and how to have that conversation. And we learned that we could do both. That in fact, what we now know as RED or RED Plus has become a central piece of the climate negotiations and of the climate policy process. And in fact, we can do both. We can have that conversation. So I think that, to my mind, as we look at the public messaging, that we still see the 100% renewable language, the public-facing version of that, by the way, on an Eiffel Tower that was powered presumably by nuclear power, we really have to move past that and be responsible for, as we've been talking about here, the range of risks and uncertainties associated with mitigation technologies that many of us don't like. Many of us would prefer not to see. And your own filter may bias you in terms of which you prefer and which you don't. But the fear that conversation will take the winds out of the sails of reducing emissions through renewables and other, if you will, preferred technologies, while it's an understandable fear, I think it's an evidence-less fear. And that we need to have that public conversation. We need to be talking about risks and trade-offs and issues of equity associated with technologies that we may need to consider even if we ultimately decide not to deploy them. And the equity dimension of this, I think, is really important. We've talked here today about the motivation from small island states and other vulnerable nations vulnerable in particular to sea level rise, as a centerpiece of the motivation for bringing us to a 1.5 ambition. But of course, the distribution of risks and trade-offs associated with mitigation technologies may fall on other nations. Think about biomass, bioenergy capture and storage. BECS may be very much focused on nations with large amounts of arable land, where there'll be trade-offs with food security in terms of its expansion at scale. So we need to be able to, if we're actually going to consider these technologies, we need to be able to have a conversation with civil society, developed and developing countries, about the risks and trade-offs that may fall unequally relative to the trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation. And I hope we can do so in a way that is brought into the special report in the context of sustainable development and move past the constraint so many of us feel from talking about technologies, whether it be BECS or solar radiation management, out of the fear that it will somehow reduce our ambition for reducing emissions. I think that's a possibility, but I think we have an obligation to try and figure out how to have evidence-based conversations about those risks, not just in the scientific community and not just among ourselves, but more broadly with civil society. So with that, I'll stop and open up the floor for discussions, questions, feedback to any of the panelists. Let me ask, just in the interest of time, for maybe 3 people to make points, and then we'll draw upon them in our discussions. So let's see who's not been fully engaged. Well, let me start with you, Salim, and then the 2 over here as well.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to Henry and Benito as well. So your description of the situation some years ago when adaptation was first starting reminded me, because I was one of the people that brought up adaptation at that time. And I was told by very good friends of mine in the NGO community, the Climate Action Network, not to bring it up, because it will jeopardize action on mitigation. And as you've just rightly described, over time, they realized the folly of their ways. You have to do both. You cannot do just one and think that by not talking about adaptation, you're going to jeopardize mitigation. We actually find ourselves in a very similar situation right now on the issue of loss and damage. I get the same reaction when I talk about loss and damage, which is, don't talk about this, it's a taboo subject. In the context of funding for research, it is actually a political economy of research issue, because no funder of research is funding research on loss and damage. There's a huge demand for this from the South, but there's no research money in the South. Global research money is northern research money, and there is no northern research money for loss and damage, and hence no research on loss and damage being done, even though there's a huge demand and a huge research gap on this issue of loss and damage. And I look to everybody here to rectify that gap. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm Lydia Messling from the University of Reading. I was just wondering, what role, if any, do you think climate change scientists should take in bringing these issues of equity to the attention of policymakers in their research and other communications?
Thank you. Let's take one more question. I believe, David, you had your hand up. So.
More a comment following up on your comment that it's empirically unclear whether or not discussion of these technologies will in fact reduce efforts to mitigation. But I feel there's a separate axis there, separate from the fact that it's empirically unclear, which I think is about what our job is. So to me, the job of many of us in this room is to inform policymakers and our fellow citizens so they and us can make decisions. We're also citizens. And if we presuppose that they will make the wrong decision because we tell them something that we think is a fact, I think that would be deeply arrogant of us. It's our job to try and tell the facts as we know them, and then also argue what we think should be done. But those are separate things. It's not our job to bury facts because we think people will make the wrong decisions with them.
Okay. Henry?
I agree. I agree that people were wrong to say that we mustn't talk about adaptation. It'll distract from mitigation. But I do also think what I argued in the talk, that a really poor country that can't afford all this stuff is going to have to set its priorities to deal with the things that it thinks are going to protect the basic needs of its own people, and that may mean adaptation, not mitigation, simply because there's not enough money for it all. And for that reason, I think some of the rest of us will have to step in or it won't happen, because some countries simply don't have enough. Scientists' role in equity is very tricky, as I know all you scientists have. Even scientists' role in policy is tricky. I mean, you look at what's happened to Jim Hansen, who's now, some people won't believe a word that he says anymore because they say he's turned into an advocate. It's very tricky business, I think. I myself think that at least senior scientists should speak out. I think it's trickier for junior ones to speak out both on policy and equity, but that's a hard thing. David, I think you have to choose your arena. I mean, if I want to get something done in the United States, the last place I would go is the US Congress. I would go to the California legislature, the Seattle City Council, the New England states, you know. So, yeah, I mean, I think we need to make our arguments, but I think we also need to recognize that some people have been bought and they're not going to respond, and we need to treat them accordingly.
I agree. Yeah, I'll just say one point on the issue of equity. I think we do have responsibilities to talk about it. I think it's really a function of how we think about our research design, if nothing else. If we're looking only at tons of carbon mitigated as a measure of the impacts of our work, and we're not looking at the distribution of the benefits associated with those reductions, we're only asking a narrow slice of the empirical questions that are relevant to decision making. So we don't have to be experts on questions of equity as scientists in order to make sure that our research is informed by the fact that equity is a consideration and an appropriate one to be taken into account in both public and policymaker responses to that science. I just want to check with Jim Hall if he's here about the time. We're about 5 minutes over. We're sitting between you and drinks. That's a risky place to be. If there's interest in a few more minutes, I assume we can continue to go. What would you recommend?
I think we should go on for a couple more minutes.
Okay, let's take another 3 questions up in the middle here. This woman here.
Thank you for some fascinating presentations and a very different note, striking a very different note from what we've been hearing through the day. I'd like to take the conversation on the Paris Agreement and equity a little further. I agree with Stefan. I think the Paris Agreement did try to sideline equity. Or at best, what it tried to do was to ensure that equity became an issue for national determination rather than international negotiation. But there are a couple of references to equity in the agreement, most notably in the context of this discussion, in the context for implementation of 1.5 and the 2-degree goal. So equity, sustainable development, poverty eradication are very much part of the context for implementation of 1.5 and 2 degrees. And the other reference to equity is in the context of the ambition cycle and an actually sort of ratcheting up ambition, as it were, in the global stocktake. So to what extent do you think that these hooks for equity in the Paris Agreement can actually be exploited going further, and how far can we go with those? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take another question right behind you.
Thank you. I guess what I wanted to raise is the idea that perhaps bad development is immoral. We talked a lot about we need to have the morality of how we go about tackling climate change, but as a citizen, I think bad development in the UK, in Europe, anywhere in the world is immoral, and I think we need to be careful not to disassociate ourselves and the things that we want for our morality of how we live from moving forward. And I guess a question specifically that I have is, I personally think that the 1.5 degree inclusion in the Paris Agreement was a moral bargain. It was something that came about as a moral agreement between countries to recognize that we were coming together on climate because of climate change, not just because of low carbon opportunity. And that's often where the national interest decisions around INDCs had come from, in my opinion. And the road, as we've seen today and heard today, to getting to 1.5 and to probably overshooting 1.5 is going to be rocky and difficult. And my question is, how do we handle the morality of that? How do we not let people down? How do we not build in maladaptation, but how do we fight for something because it's principled and it's right at the same time? So I'd like to hear some feedback and some responses on that kind of morality. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, Jean-Pascal.
Thank you very much. Jean-Pascal Vanipasel, Université de Louvain in Belgium. I'd be very interested, and thank you very much for your presentation. I'd be very interested to hear the two philosophers' comments on an issue that has not been discussed yet during this session, and that is solar geoengineering. I mean, there are certainly a lot of moral issues associated with that, including some equity issues, and I'd love to hear your comments on those. Thanks.
Political scientist, okay? I can certainly say something about the first Lavagna's question, I think, with a reasonable degree of expertise. The rest, I'm very ropey. I really don't think I can say a lot. But with respect to Lavagna, it's very important that we have these two hooks, okay? Because as I said, in the context of what happens now, in the context of implementation, this is where the proof is in the pudding, or the pudding is in the eating, or whatever, in the implementation, okay? And what I tried to say is that equity is not just some luxury which people have because they want to be good and have a warm glow at the end of the day. What I tried to imply is if we do not take equity considerations or inequity considerations into account, it will play into the politics, very much so, okay? I mean, if you really want to scupper an agreement, just make sure that the domestic parliament or whatever gets the feeling that this is actually unfair, and it's dead, okay? So if we want this thing to fly, or whatever agreements do, we really have to make sure that in the implementation, which is why these two hooks are important, we have some informal mechanism. I mean, for example, we have had these ideas about civil society equity reviews, but they, for example, presuppose that we have sufficient information in order to compare. These NDCs are all so different, it becomes actually very, very difficult to compare them in terms of what is a fair NDC or fair share or not. So the system itself will have to provide the information in a way that civil society or whoever, it's not going to be the UN. Okay? I mean, I sincerely do not believe that it's capable for the UN to come up with criteria of equity, with the right, the ones which we all adopt. We'll be here for the next 200 years. But the rest of us can do that, and we can shape them, and we can hope to influence the formulation of NDCs while they are still being formulated within government, and make them more ambitious by saying, look, guys, this is not going to fly. And government should also know, those who have a progressive ilk, that the equity discussion can be in their favor, because what is going to happen is that some industry lobbies will come and say, look, this is completely unfair, competitive disadvantage and all that. And if government can show and say, look, there's a study which says it is fair, right? So we are not doing something unfair. This is, equity considerations are not just the preserve of some sort of do-gooders who would like to have a warm glow. They are politically extremely important in this context. And for the other two questions, I now hand over to Hen.
Okay, I'll stick to the other two. Obviously, on the solar geoengineering, it's not for philosophers to choose between technologies. They're empirical questions. Will this work? If it works, how will it work? What a philosopher can point out is it's very important that we focus on risks to the most vulnerable. I mean, if it, quote, works, but the way it works is it improves the situation for North America and Europe, but disrupts the Indian monsoon, then that's a moral problem. But first we have to know, is that what it would do? Can it be targeted? I know I was in the session where David Keith gave his presentation. He was talking about targeting very precisely. I thought, whether one can target precisely or not, I don't know. But first thing is to find out. So what I think we can contribute is some criteria, like you don't benefit the affluent societies while creating problems for the people who are already the most vulnerable. I'm not sure, because I'm getting deaf, I'm not sure I got all of your question, but I agree that we have a moral obligation to do our best to come close to 1.5. It's a moral obligation to future generations, because otherwise we'll keep passing tipping points and make life less and less tolerable and endurable for them. But I think we also have a moral obligation to the people who are alive now, and of course that was my main point. We can't say, for the sake of future generations, we'll just have to slow down development, nor can we say, for the sake of development, let's go ahead and just overshoot in a way that we can't recover from. I think maybe we can't do both things, but I really do think there's a moral obligation to do both things, to eradicate poverty as fast as we can and reduce emissions to zero as fast as we can, because of current generations who have a lousy life and future generations who will have a lousy life if we let the temperature go even farther out of control than it is already.
Great. Well, thank you both. And with that, we should close so we can move to drinks. And Jim is going to send us off with a couple of comments. I would invite you to thank our panelists in this.